The visual is not important here. The music is not important here. The voice is not important here. What matters are the words. If you cannot listen to the words, you do not belong here. If you understand this, welcome to the Fate Club. The activation of the pineal gland is not an event that can be precisely dated, localized, or separated from the rest of reality, because it is not a switch to be turned on, but a restoration of a disrupted connection that existed in the human species long before language, authority, and systems learned to describe reality in only one direction. The pineal gland does not represent a center of power or a tool for superhuman abilities, but a translation point between layers of perception, a place where the biological shell meets the informational field of consciousness without the need for sensory mediation. What has been suppressed, encoded, and translated into symbols for millennia is now returning not as sensation, but as the natural reactivation of a function that has always been part of the human architecture. The reconnection of the pineal does not unfold dramatically. It does not announce itself with signals or visions, but manifests as a subtle shift in how consciousness reads reality, how it stops filtering information only through linear time and space, and begins perceiving relationships between events as concurrently unfolding layers. In this process, the energy center known as the third eye awakens, not as a mystical symbol, but as a functional interface between individual consciousness and the dimensional field, where information flows not at the speed of light, but instantaneously without movement. The third eye is not an opening through which one observes, but a state of processing reality in which information is received directly, without translation into words, images, or emotions. As this center begins to reactivate, humanity gradually loses reliance on external proofs and learns to discern signal from noise without mental analysis. What was once called intuition expands into a broader spectrum of perception, where it is possible to sense intention before action, the direction of events before manifestation, and the internal state of another consciousness without verbal communication. Telepathic communication in this context does not appear as the ability to read thoughts, but as the sharing of information fields, where content is not composed of sentences, but of holistic meaning. A person perceives what another consciousness carries, not what it thinks, and this transmission occurs outside of time, space, and personal identity. Telekinesis does not manifest as manipulation of objects by willpower, but as the ability to influence the probability field in which matter responds to the observer's informational state. Movement does not occur against physical laws, but through their deeper layer, where information precedes form. With the expansion of the third eye's function, subtler forms of perception also emerge, such as the ability to detect dimensional overlaps, where multiple realities unfold simultaneously in the same space. One begins to recognize that what was considered imagination is actually the perception of layers that have been filtered out due to nervous system overload and the necessity to survive in dense reality. Perception of time shifts from linear sequence to a concurrent field, where past, present, and potential future exist as different levels of the same information. These abilities are not added from outside, but released from within, directly connected to the repair and reactivation of the 12-strand CRISPR DNA, which does not represent a genetic exception, but the original blueprint of human conscious architecture. Each restored strand does not confer a higher status or spiritual rank, but expands the bandwidth of perception in which more complex dimensional information can be processed without identity fragmentation. Depending on how many strands are functional, the way consciousness perceives reality changes, not as better or worse, but as wider or narrower. At lower numbers of active strands, perception is bound to matter, separateness, and cause and effect. With the gradual restoration of more strands, reality ceases to appear as a solid structure and begins to behave as a dynamic field, where intention, attention, and internal state of the observer influence what appears as the external world. Dimensional perception does not manifest as colored visions or dramatic images, but as a deep understanding of connections that previously seemed random or meaningless. The pineal gland in this process functions as a decoder that translates high-frequency information into a form that consciousness can integrate without fragmentation. Is not stimulation, but synchronization, where the biological structure gradually adapts to what has always been present in the informational field of Earth. The third eye thus becomes an active interface through which multidimensional reality can be perceived without leaving the physical world. With this expanded perception, abilities historically attributed to gods, prophets, or initiates appear, yet in reality, these are natural functions of consciousness in a state not artificially limited. One begins perceiving the energetic structures of space, subtle flows of information between beings and events, and invisible architectures that shape social systems, relationships, and historical cycles. These impressions are neither emotional nor dramatic. They are neutral, precise, and silent, like reading a map that was always present but unrecognized as a map. Telepathic exchange expands beyond human communication, encompassing the perception of Earth's consciousness, collective fields, and non-physical intelligences, which do not communicate with language, but with states. Telekinetic influence manifests as the ability to harmonize the environment, shift event trajectories through probability, and interact with matter without physical intervention. Dimensional vision allows the recognition that reality is layered and that each being moves within the layer it is capable of perceiving and processing. The repair of Chris DNA is not a technological intervention nor a ritual, but a self-regulating process in which the original template of consciousness realigns with current conditions of existence. Each reactivated strand increases the capacity of consciousness to remain stable in the presence of higher informational frequencies without escape, denial, or projection. The third eye does not become a tool of power, but a point of balance where perception occurs without interference. Humanity thus gradually shifts from a reality based on interpretation to one based on direct perception. What was once considered supernatural is revealed as natural in an environment where consciousness is not separated from the informational field, but is an active part of it. The pineal gland, the third eye, and the 12-strand DNA do not form a hierarchy, but an interconnected system whose aim is not transcendence, but integration. In this state, abilities do not develop to create distinction, but because the conditions of reality change, where old limitations no longer function. Telepathy, telekinesis, and dimensional perception become side effects of restored connection, not the goal or proof of development. One perceives more because reality is more legible, not because one has become something else. The entire process occurs quietly, without confirmation, authority, or external guidance. The pineal gland does not activate. It merely remembers its function. The third eye does not open, it merely stops closing. Chris DNA is not repaired forcibly, but by returning to the original arrangement that was always present beneath layers of adaptation, fear, and separation. What remains is not a new human, but a human without filters, capable of perceiving reality in its multi-layered form without needing to own, change, or explain it. The process continues regardless of understanding, belief, or resistance. If you understand this, welcome to the club.